Hello, hello, hello. I pray that each of you are doing well. I wanted to just come on for a moment on this June 19th of 2022 and share just some information about Juneteenth. Of course, we are recognizing Juneteenth this year for the second year in a row on a national level, although Juneteenth has been recognized in Texas for a while. And I know that many people will be off on tomorrow. They'll be enjoying this now recognized federal holiday on tomorrow, on Monday. That includes me. I'll be having a day off from the day job. And so we see Juneteenth and we wonder, what is this Juneteenth? A lot of people are going to be recognizing this day and enjoying this time off, but not all are absolutely sure what is Juneteenth. If we were to poll people and you were to do the same thing and ask people what is Juneteenth, and many will say, well, it has something to do with slavery, and many will jog their minds as to what this particular holiday is. And so I wanted to share a bit of information about this particular day and why it's important, because it's one of those things that we see it being recognized. We know that people will celebrate it, and some will take the time off, and many others, unfortunately, will just simply enjoy that time off, that time of refreshment, and not truly recognize it for what it is. When we think about July 4th, 1776, we heard famous statements coming out around that time, give me liberty or give me death. We know that the United States of America, we know that with the Second Continental Congress, there was a declaration made at that point, Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. And so we know that July 4th is celebrated by countless people and has been celebrated since, again, July 4th of 1776. And so for our nation, gaining our independence from Great Britain at the time, that was extremely important. Yet when we think about Juneteenth and we wonder, why is this date important? Well, we had something going on during that time, and it's a time in our nation's history that we look back on as one that was not as favorable, and it's not as favorable in history and reality at that time. So what takes place here? We know that real soon, here shortly, in just a few short weeks or a couple of short weeks or so, we will be as a nation celebrating July 4th, 1776, celebrating that independence. But what was taking place during that time? We had slavery in the land of the U.S. We had slavery taking place, so much so that during this time of 1776, we had about 2.5 million slaves in America. So as we have these original colonies and we have a reason for our newly minted nation to celebrate, there were 2.5 million slaves. People didn't have a reason to celebrate. They wouldn't have a reason to celebrate for roughly 89 years across the U.S. Where did I get the 89 years from? From the moment that our independence was declared from Great Britain, July 4th of 1776, it would be 89 years before the slaves that were in the great state of Texas would find out they were free. 89 years. So that means that 2.5 million slaves, about 20% of the 13 colonies, had no reason to celebrate independence from Great Britain. Those slaves had no reason because even though the U.S. had gained its independence, there were over 2.5 million people still enslaved, so they had no reason to celebrate. They were still on plantations and so much more in slavery. So why is Juneteenth important? On January 1st of 1863, we know then that President Abraham Lincoln was about to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. On the eve of January 1st of 1863, there was a watch night service taking place, or what's known as Freedom's Eve. This Freedom's Eve was taking place because within the African American or the black culture, we know about watch night services. Watch night services are still taking place in many churches on the eve of January 1st. They're still taking place. Even with that, many may not realize why the watch night is taking place. Well, in homes and churches all across the United States of America, prayer was taking place on the eve of January 1st, 1863. Why was prayer taking place? Because many of the freed people at the time, freed black people and many more slaves, they were gathering in churches and in homes and all across this nation. They were praying that we would indeed gain our freedom as a race of people. And that would actually take place. Those prayers were answered on January 1st, 1863, with the Emancipation Proclamation. Unfortunately, not all people in the United States, because war raged on. It would rage on, as we know that the Civil War would not end until April 9th of 1865. So as this war raged on, unfortunately, in places where Union soldiers were not heavy, where there was not a lot of Union soldiers, the word was not getting there. So the word that the Emancipation Proclamation was indeed in effect and that slavery had in essence been called to an end, it would spread throughout southern states, but it would be staggered. The understanding that the Emancipation Proclamation is now in effect and slavery is all but ended was a slow process. So I want you to think about this for a moment. This is signed, this is done with President Abraham Lincoln, January 1st, 1863. But it would be 2 years and 5 months before it was spread across all the states to make its way to Texas. Unfortunately, what was taking place, because Texas did not have a ton of Union soldiers in this great state, many of the slave owners and slave holders were beginning to shift their slaves over to Texas. And I'm talking by the thousands. They were coming to Texas because Texas was viewed as a safe haven. It was viewed as a place whereby you can continue the practice of slavery. How long? 2 years and 5 months later. That's how long it would take before the word would eventually spread to Texas. And so on June 19th of 1865, 157 years ago today, General Granger would show up in Galveston and would spread the word, would share that indeed the Emancipation Proclamation was signed and that slavery should end. Unfortunately, it would still take a while. By the time this word got about, it would still take a while before all the people found out they were free in Texas. Why? Because many of the slave owners refused to tell the slaves that they were free. They withheld information until after the harvest. They decided to withhold this information. They wanted to make sure that they got their harvest in. Was this fair? Absolutely not. And so when we look at Juneteenth and we wonder why is it that slaves celebrated, or newly freed people celebrated? Because they finally found out almost 2.5 years later that the Emancipation Proclamation was indeed in effect. So what takes place here? By the time we find this out, what comes with this General Order Number 3 that was brought into the great state of Texas by Union General Gordon Granger and the city of Galveston, employers, they were told you're now going to have former slaves and masters will now have an employer type relationship. So even with this newly found freedom, it was a recommendation that the relationships continue as now employer and hired labor. It was also a recommendation and advisement that slaves and newly freed people stay in their homes that they were at and work for wages. These people were now freed, but they were not allowed to gather at military posts, nor was there any idleness to be allowed. But where are they going to go? They don't, quote unquote, have jobs unless they take these jobs as newly hired labor on the same plantations that they were slaves. Many of them would decide that they're going to go ahead and take off and leave Texas because they're now able to move about. As they leave, they're trying to now reconnect with their families that were sold off into slavery, into other locations, other states. So why is June 19th of 1865 so important? This signified for many of the newly freed in Texas that I can now reunite with family members. I can now reunite with those that were lost. Why is it so important, and why is it that we should recognize this date? Keep in mind, between July 4th, 1776, when the Second Continental Congress declared independence from Great Britain, between that date of July 4th, 1776, of which we will see an ample amount of celebration in the United States, between that date and June 19th of 1865, we're talking about 89 years. 89 years. So for 89 years, we had roughly over 2.5 million slaves that were watching celebrations take place year in and year out on July 4th, 1776. From that point forward, for 89 years, they would watch these celebrations, yet they were still enslaved. Why is this important? 89 years. The average life expectancy in 1776 was 35 years. Think about this now. The average life expectancy was 35 years. And since it was 89 years between July 4th, 1776 and June 19th, 1865, that means that's 2.5 lifespans that were gone. Translation. On July 4, 1776, when the Second Continental Congress declared its independence from Great Britain, when you had 2.5 million people that were still enslaved, many of them would die. Well, not many. They would all die. Those during that time would die. Again, 35 years was a life expectancy. So that's 2 lifespans of people that were wiped out before they would ever get to see June 19th, 1865. So that means 2+ generations would die without ever seeing freedom. So we were celebrating from July 4th, 1776, moving forward for 89 years, but 2 generations of slaves would die without ever seeing freedom. So when people ask, why do we celebrate this? Because ultimately, we now have a date that we can pinpoint. Do I celebrate July 4th, 1776? Yes, I do, because ultimately, this is a date that allows the United States as a whole, of which I'm a part of, to be able to say we were now identified as an independent nation. Do I want us to look at June 19, 1865 and celebrate it? Absolutely. Because now it finally said we've righted our wrong and we've rectified a portion of our past, of which we can't go back and fix, but we can at least recognize that this date is significant for those that had ancestors that spanned over 2 generations that died and never had a chance to truly celebrate the freedom that the United States of America had to offer at that time. These newly freed slaves would be able to buy land. They would also register and they would vote and they would become a part of the process that the United States of America had to offer. Texas, before this ever became a national holiday in 2021, Texas was already the first state to officially recognize it as a holiday. It would be 156 years later, last year, that the nation would recognize this date. So why do I mention this? Because I just wanted to give a brief rendition, a brief summary about Juneteenth and why is it important for not just blacks or African Americans to celebrate, but why is it important for the nation to recognize, to understand and celebrate it? Because again, in a few short weeks, we will celebrate as a whole. Lots of attention will be given to July 4th as our nation's birthing with its independence from Great Britain. But many will sleep on this date. Many will not recognize June 19th. Many will not know what it's about. Many will not care what it's about. Yet, a huge segment of the American population has ancestors that died and never got a chance to experience the freedom nor the independence that's been celebrated since July 4th, 1776. Only since June 19th, 1865, 157 years, have we been able to say as a whole, as a group of people in America, black people, that we finally saw our freedom. Although it was delayed, we finally saw our freedom to be able to celebrate in the U.S. Still a lot of ground we have to cover and a ways to go. But this is a step forward to say we recognized our wrongs, we're trying to right them, and we want to recognize all Americans, and we want to have everyone with a reason to be able to celebrate the freedoms that the United States of America has to offer. My name is Dr. Tim Wesley. Thank you for listening to this brief rendition about Juneteenth. So as you celebrate this time off today and definitely tomorrow for those that don't have to go into work, remember why you're celebrating it. And remember why and what it stands for. God bless you. Thank you for listening in. God bless.